Imagine a war erupting between Israel and Turkey, and Washington suddenly faces the nightmare scenario it has spent years trying to avoid. On one side would be Israel, one of America's closest strategic partners in the Middle East, and on the other would be Turkey, a NATO member with one of the region's most powerful militaries, which is of enormous geopolitical importance to the United States. So if the unthinkable happens, who does Donald Trump choose, Israel or Turkey? Well, the answer is far more complicated than simply saying Washington will back Turkey or Israel. Simply because a Turkey-Israel war could put the United States in a strategic trap, support Israel and risk confronting a NATO ally, or restrain Israel and potentially anger one of America's most important Middle East partners. And there is another question that makes this crisis even more dangerous. What happens if the fighting begins not in Israel or Turkey, but in Syria? So that's why in today's edition of From the News Desk, we will break down for you why Israel and Turkey are increasingly coming into conflict over Syria, why Washington is desperately trying to prevent escalation, what NATO means in such a war, and most importantly, who the United States is likely to side if Israel and Turkey actually go to the war. So stay with us till the end, because the final answer may not be as straightforward as you think. Now, the biggest danger zone is Syria. Following the fall of Bashar al-Assad, Syria has become a strategic battleground where several regional powers are trying to shape the country's future. Turkey wants a major security and military role inside Syria, while Israel is determined to prevent hostile forces or military infrastructure from getting too close to its border. Well, that has created a strategic overlap. Ankara has been seeing greater influence over Syria's security architecture, including the possibility of deploying of Turkish forces at strategic locations. And Israel, meanwhile, has reportedly demonstrated that it is prepared to use military force if it believes developments inside Syria threaten its own security. Well, this is why Israeli strikes on Syrian military positions are no longer simply about Syria. They increasingly carry the Turkey dimension. If Ankara expands its military footprint in an area that Israel considers strategically sensitive, Israel could see that as the emergence of a powerful new military presence directly inside its northern neighborhood. Turkey, however, has its own calculations. President Erdogan wants Turkey to emerge as a dominant regional power. Ankara's growing influence in Syria is therefore not simply a military issue. It is part of a much broader geopolitical strategy. And this is exactly where the interests of Israel and Turkey are beginning to collide. Well, at first glance, Israel might appear to have the advantage. Israel possesses an extremely sophisticated air force, advanced missile defense systems, powerful intelligence capabilities, and extensive combat experience. But remember, Turkey is no ordinary regional adversary. Turkey has one of NATO's largest militaries, a substantial air force, a large standing army, and increasingly sophisticated domestic defense industry. Turkey also possesses that something Israel does not have, a NATO membership. And this is where the US calculation becomes extremely complicated. Now, many people assume that if Turkey is attacked, America would automatically be required to fight alongside Ankara because Turkey is a NATO member. But that is not how NATO's Article 5 works. Article 5 is based on collective defense following an armed attack against a member, but it does not mean every NATO country automatically declares war against whosoever Turkey is fighting. Instead, each ally determines what action is actually necessary. And there is an even bigger issue. If Turkey starts the conflict, NATO's response becomes far more complicated. Washington could argue that NATO should not be dragged into a war created by a member's own offensive actions. So NATO membership does give Turkey enormous diplomatic weight, but it does not guarantee that American troops would fight Israel. Now, this is the million-dollar question. If Israel and Turkey actually went to war, Washington would probably try to avoid choosing a side militarily. But politically and strategically, the calculation could lean towards Israel, particularly if Turkey is perceived as the aggressor. In fact, America's relationship with Israel is extraordinarily deep, but Turkey is equally important in a completely different way. As I mentioned earlier, Turkey is a NATO ally. Its geographical position gives it enormous strategic importance. It sits between Europe, the Middle East, the Black Sea, and the Mediterranean. For Washington, therefore, abandoning Turkey would carry enormous strategic cost. But openly fighting Israel on Turkey's behalf could be equally damaging. Well, that makes the most likely American strategy containment rather than direct intervention. If Turkey attacks Israel first, Washington could condemn Ankara while continuing to provide Israel with intelligence and defensive assistance. And if Israel attacks Turkey first, however, the situation becomes much more uncomfortable for Washington. America would likely pressure Israel to stop and would be extremely reluctant to support an Israeli campaign against Turkish territory. Basically, in simpler words, who fires the first shot could dramatically influence Washington's position. Now, the most dangerous possibility is that neither Israel nor Turkey actually wants a full-scale war, but events in Syria push them into one. Consider the chain reaction. Turkey increases its military presence in Syria. Israel considers that a presence of threat. Israel launches a strike against Syrian facility connected to Turkish military activity. Turkey responds. Israel responds again. And suddenly, what began as a dispute over Syria becomes a direct Israel-Turkey confrontation. Well, this is precisely the type of escalation Washington wants to prevent. In fact, the United States has been working on a mechanism to reduce exactly that kind of risk. Washington understands that a direct confrontation between Israel and Turkey would not be an ordinary Middle East conflict. It could create a crisis inside the Western alliance system itself. Imagine NATO's second largest military fighting a country that receives extensive US military and intelligence support. Well, the alliance would face an unprecedented political crisis. Well, European NATO members could be forced to choose between supporting Turkey as an alliance member and maintaining their security relationships with Israel. Now, there's another dimension. Russia and Iran could also attempt to exploit the chaos, and Syria could once again become the battlefield where rival powers collide. So if the question is simply, will America side with Israel or Turkey, the most realistic answer is, Washington would probably try not to choose either one militarily. That is simply because the American interest is not necessarily winning a Turkey-Israel war. It is preventing one from happening at all. And for Trump, this would be an extraordinarily difficult balancing act. Backing Israel too aggressively could alienate Turkey and destabilize NATO's southern flank. Backing Turkey could create a political crisis with Israel and undermine one of America's closest Middle Eastern partners. And staying neutral completely could frustrate both the sides. Well, that is why Syria has become so important. The battlefield may be Syrian territory, but the consequences could stretch from Tel Aviv and Ankara to Washington and NATO headquarters in Brussels. And there is one final point. A Turkey-Israel war would not necessarily begin with a dramatic declaration of war. It could begin with one Israeli strike, one Turkish retaliation, or one miscalculation in Syria. And once that happens, Washington may discover that it cannot simply stand on the sidelines. So the question is not only who will America choose, the bigger question will be, can Washington stop Israel and Turkey from forcing it to choose in the first place? And that may be the most dangerous part of this entire crisis. Well, with that, it's a wrap on today's edition of From the News Desk. Thank you so much for watching, and I'm Yash Goyal signing off for Times Now Digital. Until next time, take care and keep watching this space for more such videos.